Good evening, everybody, and good evening, everybody in Zoom land. We appreciate you all logging in tonight. My name is Hannah Traggis, and I am the senior scientist for the Freed Seed Federation, and I also work for the Marion Institute, a local organization in Southeast Massachusetts, and I manage our Frogfoot Farm program. And I am here tonight to give everyone an introductory course into the botany of seed formation. So I want to thank the Grange for hosting us this evening, and welcome to people who may never have been to the Grange before. Uh, Institution hundreds of years old in this country, and it's always been a home base for agriculture. A little bit about myself. I have grown up with plants and my entire life. My mother was a botanist and a plant biologist, and she ran a garden club for young children, and I was enrolled in that. And we really dove in and studied plants and plant biology. We did experiments with watching bean cotyledons grow in dark boxes. And she was also a back to the lander, and I grew up in central Maine. So we were doing a lot of it was normal to me, but to our neighbors, it was very strange in central Maine in 1978 to grow things like tomatillos and other types of crops from around the world. And my mother was very interested in heritage varieties and heirlooms. And, the Back to the Land movement was really seminal in bringing these old, almost forgotten varieties back into people's minds. And that concept fascinated me when I was really young, because an heirloom is like your grandmother's brooch that somebody gives you and you can carry it around with you. And to think that seeds are also heirlooms, and what they represent. Seeds are the fundamental unit of all of our food systems wherever any of our ancestors evolved. And they represent our cultural identity, who we are, who our history is. You think of any celebration you may have with friends or family, and you bring food to share. And people are always talking about the recipes that they use to prepare that. And those recipes depend on the seeds that grew that food. So I like to start, I want people to really think about, what are you doing when you're thinking about saving seeds, or when you're thinking of growing seeds? What is your intention? This topic is very often associated also with seed saving. And so why would you save seeds? Why some of us become seed hoarders? We love to save seeds so much. And seeds and seed saving and interacting with the plants and caring for these plants that give us these seeds is a very regenerative act. It restores our connection to the land. It restores our connection to our food. It restores our connection. This isn't just all about edible plants. It can be the ecological native plants that define healthy ecosystems surrounding us. And our decision to steward seed varieties can be a very regenerative act, a very restorative act for community when groups of people come together to save seeds. And a lot of us here are engaging in this work together. And saving seeds and stewarding these plants that give us these seeds is really thinking about the future. So, how many people have saved seeds before? Great. Why? Yeah, economically. Yeah, it's just amazing to see the variety. And if you're saving seeds, but you do have a budget to buy seeds, you can buy new and different seeds each year. Just keep adding to your collection. We do a lot of work at Freed Seed Federation and bioregional adaptation. We work with heritage varieties that might need a little restoration. The genetics might need to be strengthened to perform a little bit better in our more modern climates. We are also working at creating brand new vegetable varieties, different varieties of onions and peppers and tomatoes and leeks and celery, celeriac, all of it, varieties that are more bioregionally adapted to our part of the world. And that's a really important reason to save seeds. But seeds really represent hope. And in a world where it's easy to sit on your phones and doom scroll over and over again and really feel hopeless, you can really take seeds into your hand, um, and planting seeds is really believing in hope and believing in um, future generations and a better world. So I want everyone to take your hand and make a cup with your hands. So your hands are really the earliest vessel that we as humans have ever had to hold and carry things with us. Before humans were making little bowls out of things or bags or satchels, we had our hands to carry things. And when you're carrying seeds, you notice when you make that cup with your hand, you're bringing your hands closer to your body. And these things that you hold in your hand, there's this reverence, they're very precious. Just the act of holding these seeds, you're going to protect them. And one thing that I find so powerful in working with seeds is to realize that as you're holding that seed, you are one stop on that seed's journey. And there have been generations of the plant's life, its ancestors, generations of your ancestors that have brought you to this place with this seed. And when you plant that seed, you are helping it along on its journey. And this can be a really huge and humbling responsibility, but it's also full of joy and full of wonder. This is one of the most striking quotes that I've come across. There is, if you attended our seed school last year, and if you've heard Bill talk about the importance of the work that anyone can do with seeds and the work that we do with seeds, a lot has really happened in the last 100 years that has really taken the control of people's food systems, their access to food, and their autonomy over the choices they can make with the plants they grow and the food that they provide for their community. And so again, saving seeds is that regenerative act. It's an act of revolution. It's a very creative act of revolution. It's not a destructive, warring revolution, but it is really taking control of your own destiny and helping your communities achieve food security. Okay, so let's get into the botany of seed production. So plants can reproduce themselves in many, many, many ways. Plants are some of the most clever and most intricately evolved organisms on this planet. I think fungi are also very, very interesting, but we're not talking about them. And so one way a plant reproduces itself is asexually. And this type of reproduction does not result in a seed. And a lot of times it's cloning the parent tissue. So the parent tissue is growing and it breaks off a piece of itself in some form, whether it's these cloves or tubers or runners, bulbs, corms, and people think that through cloning that this is an exact replica of its parent plant. And to a certain degree, it is. But over time, these asexually reproducing plant parts can adapt to their environment, but it can take decades. It could take even longer. And today, in a much more rapidly changing climate, something like asexually reproducing plants may not actually keep up with the ability to respond to some of the crazy and erratic weather events that we're having. Okay, so I want to get that out of the way because I don't want to, people to feel that asexual reproduction was left out of the conversation. Um, so I just want to go over a little bit of vocabulary, and these terms come up a lot. And this all has to do with how plants reproduce, and it's very important for you to know when you're trying to save seeds from them, what to expect. Okay, so open pollinated plants are plants that reproduce in a large population. Genetic material is exchanged across multiple members of a population, and you can save seed from all the plants in that population and replant those seeds the next year, and they will grow and they will all resemble that original population from which those seeds were collected. And the reason why is that most of the traits that you recognize in a plant are inherited by are passed on to future generations through the maternal plant. And then there's the term hybrid. So when two separate plants have sex, that's hybridization. That's a very natural process, and that is simply just mom and dad having a baby. That's hybridization. Now, in the commercial seed world, we have what are called F1 hybrids. And F1 stands for the first filial generation. It's really just the progeny of that first mating of mom and dad, but it's done under very controlled circumstances, utilizing very specifically developed female or egg-bearing plants and very specific male or sperm-bearing plants. And F1 hybrids they're expensive. They're something that's created by a seed company. They're very expensive to create. It takes a lot of research and a lot of time, a lot of trial, and a lot of error. And so this is intellectual knowledge and property that is controlled. And if you save seeds from these hybrids, you have no idea what you're going to get when you grow them out. And that can be very exciting if you're adventurous and you want to just see what happens. There's nothing wrong with the seeds. They're generally, there are some. Bill can get into that in another lecture on another day about, some of the sterility that's built into plants these days. But in general, if you plant seeds from these F1 hybrids, it's not going to give you that perfect, red bell pepper, that you saved the seeds from. And so for home seed saving, it's probably not recommended to save seeds from plants like this, but if you want to start your own breeding program, go for it. And then people always ask, what are heirlooms? So heirlooms they're an open pollinated plant, but they are a plant that has a cultural significance and has a very specific heritage. And something that's been around for decades, something that carries seeds that carry stories with them of the ancestors who grew them and the roads that those seeds have traveled. And then GMO, genetically modified organisms, those are plants that a biotech company has developed through specifically manipulating the genetic material inside the cell. And it's actually fairly difficult to purchase those seeds. You can purchase seeds where an accidental cross with a genetically modified organism has happened. That has actually happened in corn. So there are some potential contamination, but people are afraid that they're going to buy seeds from a seed company and they're going to get GMO seeds. It's very difficult and it's very expensive, and there's all sorts of legal paperwork that you need to sign in order to get your hands on genetically modified seeds. So for the most part, you shouldn't worry about that. Okay, so seeds. What is a seed? A seed is a structure. It's a very complex structure, and the evolution of a plant's ability to form seeds is what allowed plants to really colonize the planet. Up until the point in time when plants could actually form seeds, they were restricted to very wet, moist environments and in the water itself. But a seed is a structure that can go dormant. It can withstand very difficult climatic situations, and it can often survive for years and years and years. Anyone who is in wonder every year of the weed seeds that come back when you did such a great job weeding the year before, weed seeds can stay alive in your soil for decades. So seeds are this incredible, incredible structure. And they are comprised of the 3 points. Eva mentions the embryo, this little tiny nascent plant. Surrounding that embryo is a food source that will feed that embryo when it germinates and starts growing. And then there's the seed coat. And these seed coats are really what allow the seed to survive some really harsh conditions. Some seed coats are quite delicate, but most seed coats are really, really tough. And in order for a seed to germinate, it requires a lot of different set of circumstances to get that seed coat soft enough to break open and allow the embryo to germinate. So seeds are really miraculous. They're capable of a lot of things. And so where are they formed? So seeds are formed inside of flowers, and we're gonna go into floral structure. A flower is a modified stem. So when you see, you're like all the trees right now, and you see the buds like nice and tightly budded up to go through the winter. In the summer, when the plants are growing and they're starting to branch out, that branch forms from a small bud where the stem and a leaf meet. So when a flower is going to form, it's basically formed out of all of the structures inside that bud that might have otherwise become leaves. And there's all different variations on this. And there are all different ways that a plant will hold flowers on its body. So flowers are born on structures called inflorescences. Even a single stemmed rose, that is an inflorescence. It's one stem with one flower. But these capitulums and compound umbels and complex, you can get a botany book and you can spend, a month looking at flower types, but just want people to understand that there are a lot of different types of flowers. And I should point out that something like this flower here, people think that's one flower. That is actually tens to hundreds of flowers aggregated together. And they're all different types of flowers. The flowers around the outside edge have a single petal, and then all the little flowers in the center don't have any petals at all. And something like this goldenrod, when you look in, you say, oh, that's a flower. And actually, when you zoom in, you see this. Oh, that's the little flower, but it's not. Even that is actually one of these, but just hundreds of them all aggregated together. So the flower morphology. When that bud opens up, if it was going to just be a branch, it would be one set of leaves, and then the stem would grow a little more, and a few more leaves would come off, and the stem would grow a little more, and then leaves would branch off. But in a flower, that's a very condensed process, and you have 4 different sets of leaves that become the parts of the flower. And the first set of leaves are the sepals, and those are the little green leaves that really hold and protect the flower bud before it opens. And then you have the petals. So if the flower actually has petals, those are the beautiful, brightly colored, they're modified leaves, but the beautiful, brightly colored structures that open up. And then once you get into the center of that flower, you have the structures that bear pollen and sperm, and you have the structures that bear the eggs and the ovary. So the stamen is historically been considered the male part of the plant. We're trying to get away from that sort of binary reference, but the stamen contains the anther. The anther is where the pollen is formed, and inside that pollen is where the sperm is located. And then further in towards the center of the flower is what's called the pistil, and the pistil is the portion of the plant that many would refer to as the female portion of the plant. It's the egg-bearing structure, it's the ovary-bearing structure. So there is a stigma, a style, and an ovary all connected together. We're gonna look at some close-ups of that because this is what I do in my spare time. So this is a hosta flower that I took apart. I got rid of the petals. There were no sepals. So this is the pistil, which again is the part that contains the ovary. Inside the ovary are eggs. Then there's this long style and the stigma. And then over here, down here is the stamen. And you have the anthers. And then this little stalk that holds the anthers is just called a filament. So let's look a little more closely inside the pistil. This is a daylily. They're really great to dissect because you can almost see this stuff with the naked eye and just a magnifying glass. If you have kids, this is really kind of mind-blowing for them, or it was for me. This is just a cross section, and down here at the base of that flower is the ovary, and a little more closely you can see each of the ovules, and inside each ovule is an egg. And flowers can contain one ovule inside the ovary, or they can contain 10 or hundreds. All right, so flowers have, there's a lot of variation in this. What I just showed you is a perfect flower and a complete flower, and those are actually 2 terms that we use in floral biology, and I will explain them in just a second. So we're going to start with a complete flower versus an incomplete flower. Complete flowers are flowers that have all four of those parts we just talked about. A complete flower has sepals, petals, stamen, and pistils. All four flowers. That is complete. There are lots of flowers out there that are incomplete, and they can be missing sepals, they could be missing pistils, they could be missing stamen, they could be missing petals. They could be missing all but one of those things. So complete and incomplete. And there's the whole gamut of variation in the flower world. And it's really fun if you're really into your plants and really into seed saving to just gaze at your plants and figure it out. Get a magnifying glass and look at your flowers. Okay, so here are some more examples of incomplete flowers. So the daylily flower, the one that I showed you all dissected a couple slides back, has everything except the sepals. And the cucumber, I am showing you one of two different flower types you would find on a cucumber. This particular flower is the flower that contains only an ovary and ovules. It's the egg-bearing flower. And you'll see more pictures of this, and I'll explain more about this as we go along. But it lacks stamen. So it does have sepals. Those funny little hairs are actually like the modified sepals. It has petals, and it has a pistil that has the ovaries and ovules, but it does not have stamen. Okay, and now we also have another concept, perfect versus imperfect. So perfect flowers are bisexual flowers. They have both egg-bearing and sperm-bearing parts of the plant, and they are potentially capable of self-pollinating and self-fertilizing and creating their own seeds inside that flower. They don't all do that, and we're going to talk about which ones do and which ones don't. But in nature, this concept of a structure that has both egg and sperm bearing substructures is considered perfect. Imperfect flowers are flowers that lack either the sperm-bearing or the egg-bearing portion of the plant. They can have sepals and petals and one of either a stamen or a pistil, but not both. So in nature, that is considered an imperfect flower. So this is another example from the cucurbit family, just like the cucumber picture in the last slide. These are patty pan squashes because they're adorable. Flower on the right is that egg-bearing flower, and the flower on the left only has the sperm-bearing structures, only has the stamen. All right, so pollen. Pollen is another really cool thing to look at under a microscope or really, really powerful magnifying glass. But inside each pollen grain are actually two sperm, but we're really only going to be concerned with one. So one pollen grain contains, I have to say it, two sperm, but only one sperm that we're gonna that we're really gonna care about tonight. And that's important when we come to how seeds are actually made. Pollination is simply the delivery of pollen from the flower bearing a stamen to the portion of a flower that has the ovary and the ovules. So it's simply just the process that pollen is moved. It can happen via wind. It can happen via some sort of animal-mediated process. And if it's animal-mediated, plants have evolved all sorts of ways to entice animals to do their sexual bidding. They are colorful and attractive. They smell good, and they have nectar. Plants have evolved nectar as a reward for pollinators to come to the flowers, get some food, and as those pollinators come to the flower, they pick up pollen, and then they go to the next flower and they deposit that pollen. And whether the insects know that they're doing this or not, they're in it for the cookies, and everyone wins from this situation. So wind, insects, even gravity can move pollen around. And once that pollen actually gets to the pistil, that female portion of the plant that has the stigma at the end and that long, slender style and the ovary. Once that pollen grain reaches that the pistil, pollination has happened. And then the next thing that needs to happen is that biochemically at the tip of the pistil, that on the stigma, it either biochemically recognizes the pollen as something that should be there or not. And it's like a key unlocking the gates to heaven. So if recognition happens, a little structure grows out of the pollen grain, and it's called a tube cell, and it literally grows all the way down the style of the pistil and into the ovary. So, all right, I'm stepping away from the computer, but I'm trying to speak really loud. All right, so the pollen grain lands on top. This is the pistil here. At the top is the stigma. I was always taught it was the sticky stigma. So the pollen lands there and it sticks there. And if the stigma recognizes the pollen as a welcome visitor, then the pollen grain will germinate. And this tube, the little red structure, if you're watching from Zoom, the red structure will actually grow all the way down the style of the pistil and down into the ovary. And so depending on how many ovules are in this ovary, you may need a lot of pollen grains. So once that pollen grain reaches the ovary, it will deliver that one sperm to the egg that's awaiting in one of the ovules. If you have multiple ovules, each ovule has an egg in it. Each ovule needs a separate pollen grain to reach that flower through the process of pollination and to reach the egg. Once the sperm reaches an ovule and fuses with the egg inside that ovule, then you have fertilization. So just like in animals, the egg, the sperm, they meet, fertilization happens, and an embryo will begin to grow. Once all of that has happened, once you have the pollen on its journey and then the pollen tube on its journey, and that egg finally meets, the sperm finally meets the egg inside an ovule, a whole bunch more things are triggered. And so from each ovule that is fertilized by a sperm, by a pollen grain, each ovule is going to develop into a seed. And once all the ovules or most of the ovules inside that ovary are fertilized, that stimulates that ovary to develop into a fruit. And if only half of the ovules inside an ovary are fertilized, only half of that ovary is going to develop into a fruit. So again, it's a very localized stimulation of the fruit formation directly around the ovules that have been fertilized and are busy developing into seeds. How many of you have seen the weird zucchinis in the middle of the summer, or the weird the weird cucumbers, little pinch in the middle, or they're fat at one end and just like completely undeveloped at the other end. And it even happens in tomatoes. You'll see tomatoes where they're like nice and fat and plump, and you'll see this like really weird indentation. And that happens because of incomplete pollination of of all of the ovules in that ovary. And a lot of times this happens because of environmental factors. So one of the most important environmental factors that leads to incomplete pollination is when the pollination events might happen later in the day. And for a flower that has a great big huge ovary and those big long pistils, say in the squash family, that pollen tube has a long way to grow, and it really needs to get there pretty quickly. Pollen tubes are only viable for that one day, and it's a temperature dependent because it's an enzymatic reaction that is the growth of that pollen tube. It's mediated by enzymes, and enzymes are very sensitive to temperature. So in the summer, it's a beautiful summer day, could be 80, 90 degrees, and it can drop down to 55 degrees at night or 60 degrees at night. So if that pollen tube hasn't reached the ovary by the time that temperature cools things off enough for the pollen tube to stop growing, it will not resume growing the next day. Another thing that could happen is you could have a nice, bright, sunny morning and the bees are out and they're carrying pollen and everything's great. And then all of a sudden you get a super rainy afternoon, thunderstorms, torrential rain. The rain can actually wash the pollen away from the flowers, and it can also force some of our pollinators to take shelter and to stop working. Okay, so in summary, fruit and seed formation are intricately related. Seeds form from a fertilized ovule, and that ovule, again, is little tiny structure inside the ovary that contains an egg. And then the fruit forms from the ovary once the ovules have been fertilized. There are some weird fruits out there that can form, like bananas. The fruit can form without any of this happening, but we're not talking about that. So yes, flowers are really variable. There's a lot of weird things that plants do. And now we want to talk about what are called mating systems. So mating systems are how plants allow that genetic material to cross. And a lot of this has to do with plants' tendency to be tolerant of inbreeding or not. Some plants can self-pollinate. That's about as inbred as you could get. And some plants do that obligatorily, like always. Other plants are absolutely incapable of self-pollinating because they are completely intolerant of inbreeding. And evolutionarily, that is the way those plants have come to be in their modern state. So mating systems, we talk about self-pollinating plants, we talk about cross-pollinating plants, and then there is everything in between. And just when you think you have sulfur figured out, you realize it can actually cross. Understanding what you're dealing with will help you navigate this a little bit better when you're preparing to try to save seeds. Okay, so back to these mating systems. So now we understand all about our flowers. We're going to talk about self-pollinating plants. So self-pollinating plants are plants that have perfect flowers. And that means it is a flower that has both the pollen bearing and the ovule bearing, the sperm bearing and the egg bearing inside that flower. And often the transfer of pollen to the stigma happens before that flower even opens up. So in an example of this pea and beans are also very, very similar. Inside that flower, the way the stigma grows, the stamen, which has the pollen on it, the stamen is actually wrapped around that. And as the stigma grows, it just grows through that. And the pollen is transferred to the stigma as the stigma is growing. That happens before you see this beautiful white flower in your garden. It probably happened a day or even 2 days before you see that pea flower in this state. Now, you could get a very curious bumblebee that is crawling around the flower, and their back leg might poke through, and they might pick up pollen, or they might be carrying pollen from another plant. And so, we consider peas and beans to be perfect selfing plants, and you save seed from them, and the next year you're like, wait a minute. So like I said, all bets are off. But in general, that is the mechanism by which a self-pollinating plant works. Then you have plants that people think of as self-pollinating because they often do, and they're very capable of self-pollinating. They're also very tolerant of self-pollinating. And I'm stepping away from the computer, so yell at Bill if you can't hear me. All right, so tomato flowers are often considered reliable self-pollinating plants. And they really can be, but if you look very closely at your tomato flowers, again, with your handy dandy magnifying glass, you will, and now you know what to look for. You're going to look for the pistil, the female egg-bearing portion of the plant, and the tip of that pistil is the stigma. And if you look at this tomato flower on the left, you're actually going to see that that stigma is out in the open. And this structure here is actually the anthers. So the anthers form a fused cone around the stigma. So again, the self-pollinating tendency of a tomato is as that little flower bud is just starting to show yellow and maybe just starting to open up, the stigma is growing through this anther cone, is just fused right around it, and the stigma is growing through it. So, lots of pollen are being sloughed off onto the stigma. But this flower is still very viable, and at this point, the stigma is now exerted. And bumblebees love tomatoes. They love tomato flowers, and they're all over your tomato patch. And there's a phenomenon called buzz pollination. So buzz pollination actually helps more pollen inside that anther cone shed onto the stigma. The bumblebees get on there. It's a certain frequency. You can look this up. This is there's like YouTube videos about this. There's all sorts of information about this. But the bumblebees get on there, and it's that, and the honeybees have it's a different frequency. So in the case that you have here, the bumblebee's on the flower, it's picking up pollen. And when it lands on this flower, it's going to bring pollen from another flower, from another tomato flower. Then you have an instance where, like the tomato flower on the right here, you can see the anther cone is actually closed over the entire stigma. So the stigma is in here, and the anther cone is fully closed around that. That is more difficult for cross-pollination, but not impossible. Again, the bumblebees, they crawl all over this, their legs are poking in, and so you will still get pollen from other tomato plants that can pollinate. Because remember, those tomatoes, how many seeds are in a tomato? And each one requires one pollen grain. So you can get some cross-pollination. So we consider tomatoes to be selfers, but they're not. They can be. And this is, again, so if you want to save seeds from your tomato plants, it is variety specific, but there is so much variation. You need to get out there and look at your flowers before you decide what you need to do. There are ways to, you can put little bags over the flowers so that the bumblebees can't get to those flowers, and then that does force them to self-pollinate. But you need to make the observations and have that relationship with your plants and with your land to really know what you need to do. All right, so moving a little bit down the spectrum away from the selfing plants, we have flowers where we could have crossing, or we could have self-pollination. And now we're getting into some plants that don't really tolerate inbreeding as much as the sulfurs do. And there are some mechanisms that plants have used to protect themselves from becoming inbred. So we have onion flower on the left, and we have brassica flowers on the right. And these are flowers that are perfect flowers, and so they are capable of producing the pollen and the ovules. But in order to prevent the pollen from pollinating and fertilizing flowers on that same inflorescence, there's a mechanism called protandry, and that really just means that the pollen is mature at a different point in time than the ovules and eggs are. And so generally when this happens in plants, the pollen ripens first and is carried away from the flower. And then the female portion of the flower becomes mature and can receive pollen. I will also add that in a lot of these cases, there is also an incompatibility in the recognition of the pollen and the stigma. It recognizes that it's its own pollen and it won't allow that pollen grain to germinate. So there's also some level of that. And then in the case of the brassicas, for a certain amount of time, they're simply just completely incompatible. And it really is just the incompatibility of the pollen grain with the stigma. There's no recognition when that pollen grain lands on the stigma, even though it's the same, the same species. So those are ways that flowers have evolved to be able to produce all the pollen and the ovules in the same place, but to not allow self-pollination. So now we're going to go on the far end of the spectrum. And now we're into plants that are really obligate crossers. They really are completely intolerant of self-pollination, and they really need to make sure that they are getting pollen from a fairly wide range of sources. And in the case of our cucurbit plants, we saw these as examples early on in the talk about imperfect flowers, where we had the egg-bearing flowers and the sperm-bearing flowers, and they are separate flowers, but they are on the same plant. And that is one house housing both the sperm-bearing and the egg-bearing plants. That's a monoecious plant. Mono means one, andecious is house. So one house for the both of these types of flowers. And generally, in these circumstances, that pollen-bearing flowers open a few days before the plant even begins producing the ovary ovule bearing flowers. So it separates the sperm and the egg spatially and temporally. So it separates it over time and over space. Because once the season gets on, then the plant is producing both types of flowers within the same time frame. And then, oh, here's just another picture, side-by-side comparison, and you saw this earlier. Okay, and then we have the most extreme example and of the crossers where the plants have evolved to separate the sperm-bearing plants from the egg-bearing plants completely. They are two separate plants. So using older terminology, there are separate male plants, two separate female plants, not even on the same plant. So on the left, those are actually the female spinach flowers. I think they're incredibly beautiful. And they kind of remind you of the corn silk a little bit, very beautiful. And then on the left are the pollen bearing plants. And often in populations where this is the mating strategy, so this is their strategy of making sure they have the healthiest degree of pollination. Generally in these populations, the pollen-bearing plants are fewer in number, and the ovary and egg-bearing plants are more plentiful in the population. And that's a pretty common theme in nature, in, plants, animal world, that we see all over the place. Okay, so it's been a wild ride. You guys are doing great. And now and this is actually, I do have several handouts in the back, and I made a quick table of what are called isolation distances. But there's two considerations you really need to make. Now, taking all of our knowledge of flowers and pollination and fertilization and fruit formation and selfers and crossers, and having in mind this inbreeding depression, the other thing we really want to take into consideration is we call it the genetic maintenance and the genetic integrity of a crop variety. So you really want to maintain the most robust genetics in your plants. And that requires a couple of different points to take into consideration. One is the amount of plants that you're saving seed from. And the other is the distance that you need to keep between those plants that you're trying to save seed from, in order to make sure where you can feel confident that you have gotten the pollination that you think you're getting. So population size, it can vary depending on what you're trying to do. If you're trying, and isolation distance, but population size, if you really just want to save seeds and you want to share them with your friends, and oh, this is fun, and I don't know, it might be an orange tomato, but it might be red and it's fun, save seed from a couple plants, and it doesn't matter, they're growing right beside each other, and that's fine. But if you really want to make sure that, I'm growing, this is going to be a terrible example, but it's the first thing popping into my mind. I'm growing brandywine tomatoes, and I want to make sure that when I save seed from this brandywine tomato, and I share it, that everyone's going to grow it and it's going to make this exact tomato next year. Then you want to make sure you're growing more of those plants, and that you're growing all of those plants in one location, and you're keeping any other plants that might cross-pollinate into them a certain distance away. So that's the population size, is the number of plants that you're saving seed from, and isolation distance is the distance you need to keep that variety away from other varieties. So for something like a sulfur, you may want between 5 and 20 plants. And why is that? They self-pollinate. You should just save seed from one. Well, they're individuals, and even though they're giving you a fruit that has a lot of shared traits each year, you're saving from your sugar snap pea, and when you save seed from that and you grow it, you get a sugar snap pea. But they're individual plants. They are as genetically distinct as we all are from each other. Well, not quite as distinct as we all are from each other. Uh, and so you want to keep some of that diversity in the population that you're really saving seed from. And you want to make sure you're saving seed from, when it sulfurs, you save seed from plants that all have the same fruit that you're looking for. But you should really save seed from more than one plant. So then when you get into those middle of the road plants, it can vary. You may need to grow 20 or 30 peppers. You may need to grow 75 or 80. It depends. There are tables where you can look up this information. And like I said, I have a handout where I pulled some of this information. So like Brassica family, do this. Apiaceae family, do this. Separating these plants, you might need to separate the populations by 30 feet to half a mile. Once you get into the types of plants that really need to cross, things like, say, our spinach again, or even things like corn, where the pollen is actually very light, it's windborne, and it can travel a really long distance. And so in order to keep the seeds pure that you're trying to save, that distance is going to increase over time. So there are ways that you can try to isolate your plants if you don't have the distance. You can, depending on how that plant is pollinated, if it's insect pollinated, you could maybe just put cages around your plants that can exclude the insects. Oftentimes, isolation distances can be shortened by, if there's a huge hedgerow or a small forest between you and the other pollen sources. But it's really figuring out, okay, how is this plant being pollinated and what can I do to prevent that pollen from coming in? If it's wind pollinated plants, that pollen is usually tiny. And so just putting a cage around it is often not enough. The mesh that's used horticulturally to exclude pollen is very specialized. I mean, if you're growing vegetables, if you're growing carrots and there's Queen Anne's lace nearby, that's a problem. You're going to get a lot of cross-pollination. If you're growing tomatoes and there's maybe wild solanaceous plants, they're not going to pollinate your plants. In general, it has to be pollen from the same species. Plants are weird, so it doesn't always work out like that. Peppers have all sorts of ways to cross-pollen between species, which is wild, but in general, if you're just growing like standard vegetable varieties or even ornamental plants that you want to save seed from, you just have to know your environment. All right, so the next few slides are really going into, now we know all of this, what do we need to think of when we're actually saving seeds? You've studied your plants, you've hand pollinated them, you've built your cages, and you've got the right amount of plants out there. And now you actually want to physically harvest those seeds. So what are a few of the things that you need to know? And this is not everything. There is, again, like we could spend years talking about this. But it's important to understand there are, in general, two basic fruit types, ones that are wet and fleshy, like tomatoes, where inside the seeds are are gooey and the flesh is moist, and it's not always gooey because squash aren't gooey, but there's the wet seeded crops. And these are fleshy, soft fruits. Generally a structure that has evolved to, again, utilize an animal to help this plant complete its life cycle by eating this fruit. And then we have dry fruit. And this, you really need to understand this, because if your plants are just growing, a lot of seed savers I've talked to are like, oh, I was watching it, and then I went to visit my grandkids, and then I came home 3 days later and the seed was gone. So it's really important to understand when you should get out there to get that fruit off of your plants in order to save the seed. So for your dry fruits, there are 2 subcategories of how that seed is dispersed in nature. So there are dry dehiscent fruits, which simply means when that seed pod dries up, it cracks open. And generally, so that little vein on a bean pod that everyone, you're shelling your beans and you pull that off, it's actually a very complex cellular tissue in that bean. And it is designed that when it gets dry enough, it cracks open. So it's actually really brilliant built-in abscission layer that the plant builds into the seed pod itself. And then you have dry fruit types that the fruit remains closed. And so really good example of this is this dill seed head. And all of those little things that you think are seeds are actually fruits. So each one of those seeds is a little fruit capsule. And when it dries, it will simply just fall off of the seed head and shatter to the ground. And then that a lot of these plants are the ones where they will self-seed in your garden, and that's because it's actually still inside this fruit structure. It has not just the protection of the complexity of that seed coat, but also of the fruit surrounding it for the winter. And then it will germinate very easily the next year. And these are often related to where in the world, the regions in the world where these plants evolved and why these strategies exist. And then there are a couple of other seed types, or dispersal mechanisms. They can form all sorts of beautiful accessory structures that act like little sails and help carry these seeds on the wind. They have other structures that can grab onto animal fur and be carried far and wide. Plants love exploiting animals. And then my favorite is the Bellochary dehiscence, which is when that seed pod, it's again the seed pod that is dehiscent, so it will crack open, but it will actually crack open explosively. This is a lot of fun. If you grow lupins, get the nice dried lupin seed heads, put them in a bucket in the backseat of your car and drive around in August. And they will just, and ask me how I know. But this mechanism really has evolved for these seeds to really scatter further away from the parent plant instead of falling right on the ground beside it and crowding themselves out. Plants we think of as being immobile organisms, and that's why all of these mechanisms have evolved and so many more things that plants do. But plants can move. And this is one of the ways that they move themselves. And plants really operate beyond a single organism. They operate as a population. They operate as a community. And, when we think of a plant moving, we think of as animals under our own feet, and we are going to move. Plants really operate on that population level. And so that's how they move through the world. Okay, so for those of you in the Zoom audience, the top 4 references here are the books that I talked about a couple of minutes ago. I had created a list of 75 seed companies that I like, and so if anyone wants to see that, you can scan the QR code. I promise this just goes to a very nerdy list and this list needs to be updated. I made this list 5 years ago, and I have like at least 50 more companies to add to this list. Both Bill and I contributed to this special edition of The Natural Farmer, which is the publication of the Northern Organic Farming Association. They did a special issue all on plant breeding. This is the first article in that series. Bill did one that is further down in it, but also available last year and for a couple of years before that. We've been presenting the Seed School, which is a 6-week series of talks that go through each, really focusing on vegetables, but going through each of the major categories of vegetables, and a whole lecture dedicated to saving seeds from those. And those were digitized last year thanks to a grant from the Grange, which is amazing. So you can just go to our website and you can find the link to it, or you can scan the QR code. And then finally, if you do not want to take paper copies of the 4 handouts that are in the back, you can scan this QR code. I am really overboard on QR codes. So, yeah, I mean, I have some more slides, but that's it. That's good. Well, I mean, really, it's just how you save seeds from wet seeded crops. You scrape them out of the cavity, and you put those seeds in a jar, and you just add some water. Some people also add a pinch of yeast, and you ferment the seeds. So another thing I should add is that fruits, really, they are there to protect and nurture the seeds, and also to help with the dispersal of those seeds. One way that they protect the seeds is often the fruits themselves contain substances that maintain the dormancy of that seed. Now, we've all opened a tomato and found seeds germinating right inside, and little tiny tomato plants growing inside. However, that goo around each tomato seed typically does have what are called germination inhibitors. So they're chemicals that chemically keep that seed from germinating. By doing this process of fermenting those seeds for about 4 days in a jar of water like this, it helps break that goo down. And then when you dry those seeds and you go to plant them the next year, that germination inhibition has been removed. It's also a good way to clean off some pathogens. This does not clean off all pathogens. There are many seed-borne diseases of tomatoes, but there are a few that fermentation can take care of. So after about 4 or 5 days, this is what those seeds look like. And if you shook this jar, you'd see the seeds start to fall to the bottom. That's about when you know the fermentation is done. And you simply very carefully pour that off. You may need to do a couple rinses, but the goo really floats to the top and the good seeds sink. So the decanting process is actually very, very easy. Yeah, you really don't need to add the yeast. It's the naturally occurring yeast. I mean, you could probably make a sourdough starter off of your tomatoes if you are really ambitious, which maybe we should try. So that's the wet seeded crops. For things like cucumbers, squash, you don't really need and probably don't want to ferment for several days. You really just maybe want to soak overnight, and it just dissolves sort of the goo that's surrounding those seeds. For things like eggplant and zucchini, it's still considered a wet, fleshy crop, but it's a much drier crop. And it's really just chopping it up. I mean, and you just mix it with, get that flesh churned up, mix it with some water. So again, you have the seeds can sink, and then you want to, decant the plant material away from it. It's just a lot of trial and error. And then the dry seeded crops, you're threshing and winnowing. I have a handout in the back about that. So we saw some things that we thought were seeds, and we actually learned they were fruit. But also think about your wheats and your grains and even those bean pods. You want to harvest those before they dehiss in your garden, right? You want to bring those in and have them somewhere where you can control the dehiscence. So threshing is really just beating the crap out of your plant material and really trying to separate the seed from everything else. And this is important to do. A lot of people are like, well, I can probably still just plant this. And you can, but oftentimes what else is on those seed pods are eggs of little organisms. The insects are very smart. They know that there's nutritious food inside that seed pod. And so they lay their eggs on the seed pods, and then the little weevils or maggots or whatever will get down into your seed crop. And so those eggs are often on that we call it chaff. You also have a lot of disease spores that are on that chaff. If you've ever saved beans, I mean, there's oftentimes a little mold on the outside or a lot of mold. If there's a lot of mold, don't bother. Like, it's done. So you want to thresh it, and then you want to winnow it. And winnowing is separating the seeds from that chaff. There's a lot of ways to do it. In ancient times, they simply, just like the picture, the basket of seeds being tossed up in a good stiff breeze, and the wind blowing the chaff away, and the seeds being heavy enough to fall down into the basket. You could do it with your hands. You can use various size fans. You can use super beautiful, fancy equipment. We have a whole series of seed cleaning machines at Freed Seed Federation, including what's called a Winnow Wizard. The equipment is for the community, and we do have actually community-focused seed saving days. So, if we say, hey, we're having a threshing bee, come on over and see it, because it's really cool. Then the very last slide is, now that you've done all of this work and you have seeds that you have saved, you need to store them. So you want to make sure that they are dry before you close them in any container. So you want to make sure that if it's a rainy, humid, mid-August day, that you're not taking those seeds and sealing them in an envelope or a coin jar or something like that. So the seeds need to be dry. And then you want to make sure that you're storing them in fairly airtight containers. And you want to make sure, you want to keep them as cold and as dry as you possibly can. Unless you have a -80 freezer, I don't mean that cold. So the general rule in the seed saving world, this R plus H plus T is less than 100, means relative humidity plus the temperature in Fahrenheit is less than 100. So if it's 50% humidity and it's 50 degrees, you're at the upper end of one or both of those conditions to store seeds for a long time. you want to try to push those down. You really want humidity, and that is the dryness of the seed. You want those seeds really probably down around, 11, 15, 20% dry. And, the temperature probably down around 50 or 40 or 30. So people think they have to buy seeds every single year, and that is not true. There are seeds last for years and years and years. Um, Commercially traded onion seeds may be some that do have a very limited lifespan because they've been handled so much and their seed coat is very soft. But if you take care of your onion seeds, I've had onion seeds 7, 8, 9, 10 years old that germinate just fine, but I keep them dry and in an airtight container in my refrigerator. Keep them nice and cold and they will last for a long time. Yeah, so just think as dry as possible and then as cold as possible. Dry is the most important. There are a lot of seeds that you can freeze, and there are other seeds that don't love to be frozen. And my general rule for that is the more tropical in origin that plant is, the less tolerant the seeds are probably going to be to freezing. When they freeze seeds at the big seed vaults, they're using very special processes, the cryogenic freezing. So they will take seeds that probably wouldn't survive freezing otherwise and getting them to freezing temperatures. I generally at home just keep things in the refrigerator, and that's usually really cold enough as long as you're keeping things dry. If you've got it in the super humid drawer in your fridge, then it better be in a nice airtight container. And again, that's a lot of trial and error, and there's always tragic stories. I mean, in when in doubt, I just try to do what Mother Nature has done, with like my native plants. Those seeds are being planted by Mother Nature in the summer, in the late summer. And, that's really what they've evolved to do. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone in Zoom land. There you go.